Beams from portable lumens cut the frozen air of what Mylar's rough schematics identified as the Void's derelict embarkation deck. Drifting clouds of debris filled it from end to end, as if the space had been a dumping ground for the crew's junk. A ramshackle host of vehicles filled one end, secured to the deck by rusted lengths of chain. Broken skull glyphs and tusked poles twisted in the zero gravity, bumping into floating scraps of machinery and spinning off in other directions. Gelatinous blobs of molten metal spun in the air around the hole Collins' melter bore had cut through the ice-locked hull. Motes of drifting ice made the air glitter with cold beauty.
"Overlord class,"
said Mylar, slowly sweeping his lumen pack around the devastated bay. Colin shook his head.
"No, vault radius isn't big enough,"
he grunted, aiming a beam towards the curving girders overhead.
"It's a lunar, maybe a Gothic, or at least this part was."
Full auger penetration hadn't been possible thanks to the thickness of ice. But what data they'd been able to gather on the derelict's internal structure appeared to indicate the presence of at least 6 distinct vessels, some human, some xenos, all bound by a haphazard amalgamation of rock, ice and metal. Ejected from the Velos belt, most likely the result of a cometary impact, the Hulk had been on course to bypass the Charon system's trinary stars. But the orbital salvage vessel Ulixes Explorator had located the derelict and dragged it through space to the breaker yards in orbit over Arcona. Every such piece of spatial wreckage was a potential treasure trove of raw materials and lost technology. Enormous docking clamps and E-mag tethers were already attaching to strategic locations across the Hulk.
"Still got atmosphere,"
said Collins, stepping into the icy blackness of the derelict.
"Saves having to suit up the breaker servitors. And I know you hate that,"
grinned Mylar as the 10-man boarding team moved out, guns raised and the mag boots of their vac suits keeping them locked to the deck. Underslung targeting beams crisscrossed the vault.
"No signs of life,"
said Mylar, reading the feeds from the threat specs.
"Thankfully." "Agreed,"
said Collins.
"Let's find archaeotech, rare minerals, and structurally sound metals. But life, no thanks. Remember that Hulk drifting out of Kelexa Reach?"
Collins touched the Aquila on his vac suit's bronze chest plate.
"Don't even say it. You'll bring us bad luck."
Mylar grinned. Collins was always superstitious in the opening moments of a salvage operation, while it was just the two of them and their armed guards. Once the rest of the crew got on board, it was all business. But until then, the man was as jumpy as a white shield facing his first battle.
"You want me to get anyone else on board?"
Beyond the integrity-sealed breach in the hull, the salvage yard's thousands of lifter servitors, hulk breakers and tech scavs awaited, ready to bring myriad cutting tools to bear.
"Not yet,"
said Collins, as a warning rune blinked on the threat auspex.
"What have you got, Nicodemus?"
asked Mylar, pushing through the clouds of spinning debris and junk. A tusked helmet bounced from his vac suit's armored shoulder guard and spun away, its jagged toothed visor leering at him.
"Organics,"
said Nicodemus, the squad sergeant of the armed detail.
"Non-human. 200 meters dead ahead." "Couldn't have said straight ahead,"
muttered Collins.
"Had to say dead ahead."
Milo Nicodemus was a humorless man, but the Arcona Void Salvage Corps hadn't hired him for his sunny disposition. Ex militarum tempestus, Grievous wounds had seen the man rendered unfit for active service, but perfect for life as a mercenary. Clad in a bronzed vac suit with armor plates at his shoulders, groin and chest, the inside of Milo's faceplate was illuminated by the red glow of his ocular augmetic. The hell gun was his favourite weapon, powerful and without any casings or solid rounds to ricochet wildly in zero gravity.
"What have you got?"
asked Milo.
"Greenskins,"
said Milo, gesturing at the muzzle of his shouldered rifle. Collins made another Aquila. Not easy when you're holding a lumen pack in one hand. Even Mylar felt a knot of tension settle in his gut at the thought of orcs. He needn't have worried. These orcs were very dead. Two of the largest specimens floated with their meaty hands locked around each other's throats, their bestial faces twisted in mid-bellow, as though they'd frozen to death in the instant of murder. Dozens more were pinned by heavy machinery or drifting in the silent dance of brutal mayhem.
"Were they fighting each other?"
asked Collins.
"Looks that way,"
agreed Milo.
"Greenskins,"
said Mylar, shaking his head. Beyond the hull of the derelict, crudely fashioned generators wheezed with the faint accumulation of power. Frozen solid and starved of light in the icy density of the Vilos belt, ancient power-gathering panels finally drank of the star's light. Anchored in low orbit around Arcona, mechanisms that would have confounded all but the most radical priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus drew power to hissing, clanking, bellowing furnaces deep in the frozen heart of the derelict. Ice-locked corridors that had not known light and heat for hundreds of years flickered with light, and shards of ice changed back into water. Primitive motors belched smoke and fumes, and ancient machinery crafted by dead alien races screamed as their function was yoked into the most primitive and barbaric of technologies. Power spread through the derelict without rhyme or reason, rising from the depths at ever-increasing speeds. Its engines burned hot, and its sudden lurch towards Arcona's gravity ripped the salvage yard's docking clamps away in a blaze of hydraulic fluids and electrical discharge. It would take 6 planetary revolutions before the derelict's flaming wreckage finally impacted on Arcona's surface. And when it did, the terror and devastation would be nothing like the planet's inhabitants had ever experienced. Mylar had never been this close to an alien. Brutish, and with solid musculature swollen beyond imagining, the orc was armoured in steel plates riveted directly onto its body. An extravagant bicorn hat was jammed on its skull, and one eye had been sealed off with a big plate of black iron. A long, multicoloured coat streamed at its back, and with the hand that wasn't attempting to throttle its frozen enemy, it carried an enormous axe with jagged fangs running down its edge. Its opponent was no less garishly attired, with a baggy white overshirt sewn together from a number of imperial war banners. Black and yellow striped breeches were tucked into high boots of brown leather and steel reinforcements. The orc was without a hat, instead sporting a crimson bandana tied around its brow-heavy skull. It too boasted a black iron patch over one eye, and like its foe, its lip and ragged ears were pierced with gold rings and barbed hooks.
"Colourful pair, aren't they?"
said Mylar, leaning forward and tapping a fingertip against the nearest orc's iron-sheathed fangs. As long as his hand, the beast, could disembowel him and drag out his entrails with one bite. Its eyes were a lifeless, frost-rimmed crimson.
"Freebooters,"
said Collins.
"Then let's hope they had a profitable haul before their power failed and they froze,"
replied Mylar. Before Collins could reply, Mylar felt the full weight of his vac suit settle upon him as gravity returned. He grunted as he remembered why he hated wearing the heavy rig. All through the deck, machinery and floating scrap crashed to the deck with the thunder of metal on metal. The mercenaries threw up their arms as broken spars of metal fell like rain. 3 men went down, hammered to the deck by chunks of rusted iron. Milo shouted for a medicae. An insistent buzz of vox from the Ulysses Explorator sounded in Mylar's helmet, but he couldn't hear it over the crash of falling debris. Blocks of ice shattered off the buckled iron deck plates and began flowing like liquid. Overhead, lumens burst to life with a rumble of oncoming power. Light flooded the deck. Polarization filters in Mylar's helmet plunged him into darkness in response. The opacity lifted a second later, and Mylar found himself staring in the face of the freebooter with the bicorn hat once more. It blinked. Shock paralyzed him. The orc blinked again, and the 2 greenskins threw off their coating of ice as their brawl continued. They throttled one another as though no time at all had passed since freezing temperatures had halted their struggle. The rest of the orcs threw themselves at one another, hacking with toothed blades that sprayed ice chips as the motors thawed. Mylar's vox exploded with voices, warnings from the command decks of the orbital salvage yard, and shouted orders from Milo Nicodemus. Stabbing beams of lasfire blazed, strobing as the armed team rallied around their wounded.
No, don't shoot,
cried Collins.
Let them kill each other.
The 2 orcs who had been locked in an eternally frozen battle now paused and turned to the humans in their midst. Mylar was no xenobiologist, but even he could see the dawning light of comprehension in their porcine features. The orcs looked at one another, and both let out a series of grunting, hooting barks like augmetic fingers on a scolum slate. It took Mylar a moment to realize a horrendous sound that was greenskin laughter. Almost instantly the battling orcs ceased their struggles and turned towards the salvage crew. Whatever hostility there was between them was snuffed out in an instant at the prospect of fresh opponents. Mylar screamed to run, but it was already too late. Captain Grimlug Toothbreaker wrenched his axe from the back of the Humie who'd eyeballed him first. He looked right at Grimlug and hadn't even flinched, and then he'd run like a grot with a squig biting his backside.
"I's never gonna get what these Humies think,"
he said, wiping the blood from his blade and then licking it from his palm.
"What's that, Captain?"
said Bloodface, his jaw swollen and voice mangled where Grimlug had punched out his teeth.
"These here Humies,"
said Grimlug.
"Where did they come from?" "Dunno, Captain,"
said Bloodface, trying to jam a pair of fangs back into his mouth.
"Yeah, last thing I remember was the natter we was having about which is the best chopper, an axe chopper or a cleaving chopper." "Cleaver chopper,"
said Bloodface with confidence. Grimlug raised his blood-smeared axe.
"I think you'll find it was an axe chopper." "Oh yeah, so it was,"
nodded Bloodface. Things had gotten heated when each weapon's fans started trying to show theirs was superior weapon by demonstrating just how good it was by chopping limbs off of their rivals in the debate. And then it got really out of hand. Bloodface, Grimlug's loyal first mate, had smelled opportunity and decided to use the developing scrap as a chance to prove he was the best. Grimlug remembered the ship had been shouting at them throughout the scrap, Humie words that didn't make much sense. Stuff about things falling or failing, critical this and critical that. Wazaka had shot the shouty horns on the wall with his big dagger just to shut them up. Then it got a bit cold and a bit hazy. He'd been strangling Bloodface, then suddenly Grimlug couldn't move and felt really cold. He must have had a bit of a nap then, because the next thing he knew, there was a Humie with his head in a glass bubble, looking at him like he wasn't afraid or nothing. All the lights had come on, and Grimlug didn't feel as cold. Things got shooty and choppy after that, and now all the Humies were dead. He could feel the ship was moving again, but he had no idea where they were going. Felt like someplace warmer than the place that they were with the big icy rocks. And if it were getting warmer, it meant there'd be planets where Humies what needed a good stomping and their stuff looted could be found.
"Here,"
he said, pointing to a big hole in the side of the ship.
"That weren't there before, was it?" "No, Captain,"
said Bloodface.
"Never seen it before. What do you reckon on the other side?"
Grimlug thought about that for a moment, scratching the iron patch over his thinking eye. The glacial thought processes of his brain shifted gears. Grimlug Toothtaker weren't captain of Toothjaw's revenge for nothing. He had a thinky head. He knew the best whatnots for finding Humies to stomp.
"I think that's where Humies come from,"
he said, the thought slowly grinding its way through his brain.
"I think they thought we was all dead and that they could steal our ship." "Why they think we was dead?"
said Bloodface.
"Dunno. Humies are a bit stupid like that,"
said Grimlug.
"Maybe it was on account of us all being frozen like."
Bloodface nodded without understanding. Grimlug lifted a stomped Humie helmet from the desk. The glass visor was broken, and there was still a head inside. He shook it out as he heard voices coming from inside. He held the helmet to his chewed ear.
"What's it saying, Captain?"
asked Bloodface, as the rest of the boys geared up with their preferred choppers and gathered around.
"Dunno. It's Humie speaks."
Bloodface's eyes lit up as something almost like a thought surfaced in his skull.
"You think there's any left on aboard the other ship for us to stomp?"
said Bloodface. Grimlug grinned, exposing his iron-jacketed fangs.
"You know, I think there might just be."